right? Does that?
Yep, we can see it.
All right, so. So today's speaker is, as everybody knows, First Lieutenant Chase Wickersham, quad 50s and dusters in support of artillery batteries. Yeah, as you can see, the branch of service, United States Army. The unit was B Battery, 4th of the 60th Air Defense Artillery Dusters. Active duty dates January 69 to 71. Vietnam Campaign Central Highlands. Recipient of the Bronze Star Medal, the Vietnam Service Medal, the Arvin Campaign Medal. And David Hayward is joining us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chase.
Let's see if we can get this thing to come up.
It's going to work.
So I will share my screen. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can. Looks good.
Yes.
Unfortunately, wait a second. There we go. All right. Can you see the screen?
We can see the screen, and your PowerPoint slide is working.
Hey, look at that. All right. Well, this is a presentation about my tour in Vietnam in 1970. This is the second time I've done this. As Scott said, that we did this again. We did this once in 4 years ago when Jack was still around. I thought I'd start with explaining how I got to Vietnam. I graduated high school in '64, and I started college at Claremont Men's College out in Pomona. I joined ROTC in '65 as a sophomore. You might wonder why. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was passed in '64. Troops on the ground in Vietnam in '65 went from 20,000 to 200,000. All we ever talked about in college was a draft. ROTC was only a 2-year enlistment, and the ROTC colonel promised me I'd be non-combat because I wore glasses, and I believed it. So in the tradition of civilian soldiers in my family, I graduated in '68 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army Air Defense Artillery. My grandfather on the right in this picture was a second lieutenant in World War I and served in France in the mounted artillery. My father on the left was a first lieutenant, Army Air Corps, World War II as a B-17 bomber pilot, was wounded on his 25th mission over Germany and awarded the Silver Star and the Distinguished Flying Cross. And this picture was taken on the day that I was commissioned on my graduation day. So I was the third generation Wickersham second lieutenant, soon to be in another war and hoping to avoid combat. So they sent me to Fort Bliss for Nike Hercules training as a unit missile commander. My first assignment was the executive officer of the support battery at McGregor Range outside of Fort Bliss, where the Nike batteries around the country trained each year firing missiles. Shortly thereafter, I received orders for Vietnam as an infantry officer. So much for non-combat. Someone must have figured out that I didn't have any training in the infantry. So they sent me down to Fort Benning for the Infantry Officer Vietnam Orientation course. And they didn't, and I think somebody finally realized that I'd never been through basic training, I'd never been through AIT, and I never went through OCS. So they were a little concerned, I think, that sending me to Vietnam as an infantry officer, probably not as concerned as I was. But the two-week course down at Fort Benning was basically captains going back for their second tours to take over a company. And once they found out that I was in air defense artillery and was being sent to Vietnam as an infantry officer, they seemed to enjoy telling me over and over again what my chances for survival in the field would be as a platoon leader. And needless to say, I was drinking a lot of the officers' club. So my next stop was Vietnam. I arrived in Cam Ranh Bay expecting to be assigned to the infantry, but but ended up in one of the only air defense artillery units in Vietnam. I was sent over to battalion headquarters and asked if I was trained in dusters and quads, and without any hesitation, I replied absolutely. But I really had no idea what a duster and quad was. So I ended up assigned to B Battery, 4th Battalion, AWSP, 60th Artillery, Dusters and Quad 50's. AW is automatic weapons, SP is self-propelled. This particular unit, the headquarters for the battery was in Pleiku. I came in down here in Cameron Bay, ended up going in a train, talked to the battalion. They sent me by C-130 up to Pleiku, and the headquarters were just outside of Pleiku at a place called Artillery Hill, which was a fairly large base just outside of Pleiku. And the battery consisted of 2 platoons of dusters on 6 different fire bases with 4 quads in the headquarter platoon. And the battery was scattered over 130 miles of the Central Highlands. We had a unit up at Ben Het, which was 70 miles north of Pleiku, and we had a unit 60 miles south of Pleiku at a fire base called Wade Davis on Highway 14. So after I arrived at Pleiku, I had to figure out what a duster was. And although the whole time I was in Vietnam, nobody ever told me it was an M42 A1 duster. I didn't know that, but I knew it as a duster. And for my first presentation 4 years ago, I did some research because I really never been trained in any of this, so I didn't have a lot of the terminology. But a duster was basically a weapon that came out of World War II as a mobile anti-aircraft platform for protecting the infantry. It was introduced in 1953 and saw action in Korea, but it was so slow it couldn't track jets. So it was often used for ground support, and after Korea, missiles took over the air defense role, and the units were given to the National Guard until 1966, when the Army decided to need something like the duster in Vietnam, and it scrounged enough units for 3 battalions. The duster was basically a Walker Bulldog light tank that came out of World War II, which, by the way, the ARVNs used as their primary armored track. And what they did is they pulled the gun turret and they replaced it with an open turret with twin 40mm Beaufort anti-aircraft guns. And this was another term I never heard until I did my research 50 years after I left Vietnam. Nobody ever called this a Beaufort gun, but the Beaufort was a famous anti-aircraft gun during World War II. It was designed by the Swedes in the 30s, and they sold it to everybody. The British had it, the Germans had it, the Japanese copied it, and we used it extensively. The 40mm gun was clip-fed, fired a 4-round clip of high-explosive tracer. I'm told the Beaufort would fire 120 rounds per minute per barrel with an anti-aircraft range of 5,000 meters. Needless to say, we never targeted anything in the air. And a theoretical ground-to-ground range of 9,000 meters. But my experience was in Vietnam, we used them as a line-of-sight weapon only, at no more than maybe 1,000 meters, which is about a half mile. The duster had a crew of 4. It had a gunner, 2 loaders, and a driver. Anyone who served in the Navy during World War II is probably familiar with this weapon and may have even served on one of these gun crews. The Navy used the Beaufort anti-aircraft weapon extensively, usually as quads, as these 2 pictures show. But on smaller ships, they used them as twins and singles. And notice on the picture the gun crew loading the 4-round clip into the breech of each of the barrels. This same weapon that this young man is loading in a 1942 training picture was the weapon we used in Vietnam in 1970. And we thought some of the ammunition might have come from World War II. A lot of it was corroded and it looked like it had been stored on ships for years. The round itself weighed 2 pounds each, high explosive tracer, as I said before. All of our ammo came in these aluminum cans, which I found this on the internet. And I have a picture of some of our battery unloading ammunition on a fire base using these same cans. And this was obviously during the monsoon season because of the water. But all of the fire bases were resupplied with ammo for the dusters from Pleiku. We received all the ammo and then we transported it by truck or convoy up to the fire bases. The duster in Vietnam was used in a ground support role for the infantry primarily, but also for convoy security and also for fire base perimeter defense. Dusters were always deployed in pairs on a fire base. This was one of ours. It was on a fire base north of Pleiku. They'd have several prepared firing positions in each fire base so that they backed them into it so they could move them quickly if they got zeroed in on by mortars. The firepower of a duster was really impressive. The VC and the NVA were intimidated by it. The dusters were huge targets, I was told, by the VC and the NVA. It offered a rapid rate of fire. Each round had a 50-meter bursting radius, which meant they were deadly for troop concentrations, outstanding for infantry support. And since mortar and rocket attacks were so common on the fire bases, they were excellent for suppression fire because they could quickly respond to an attack. This picture was a time delay picture I got off the internet. I tried to do this myself in Vietnam, but I never could. The pictures never turned out very well. I like this picture because you notice on the back of the track a bunch of people standing there. That's where I was usually standing during a fire mission, on the back of the track. This is a typical fire-based duster position. I had just arrived with the first sergeant in the Jeep in the foreground. Usually there was a sandbag position, a firing position for the duster, ammo storage. This particular one has a lookout on top that somebody was manning at night, and then a bunkered hooch for the crew. This one happens to be above ground. The crews would live on these fire bases months at a time, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. After 6 months, you might get a week's R&R. In my area, we were always attached to an artillery battery, never directly to the infantry. Even though in my area we had the 4th Division, but we never were attached to the 4th Division. We were always attached to the artillery batteries. Most of the time in my area, there were 175 self-propelled howitzers. That was called an M107SP for self-propelled. Sometimes it was a 155 battery, but most of them were 175 batteries. I'd never seen this weapon before, but the 175 was an amazing weapon. It had a 30-mile range. It threw a 150-pound projectile. They were incredibly loud. Notice the blade on the back of the track. The recoil was so incredible from this weapon that without that blade dug in, with each round the track would walk across the fire base. I found this picture on the internet of a 175 firing. I tried to take a picture like this a number of times, but the concussion was always so bad I always messed up the shot. Notice the high-tech hearing protection issued to the artillery in Vietnam. It's called your hands. Sometimes we were on a 155 battery. This is a crew at Artillery Hill loading a 155 for a fire mission. Now, some of the bases we were on were very small. Some of them were very large. This particular base was called Play Morong, and it was about 20 miles, I think, if I remember correctly, west of Kontum, the provincial capital, where we also had a fire base. This particular fire base was protecting a mountain yard village, and it was a 155 fire base, and it had 2 dusters on it. We always had at least 2 dusters on every fire base. And the picture was taken as I approached in a Huey to visit the fire base. I went out to this particular base a number of times on the dirt road, but if I could get a Huey to take me out or to catch a ride on a resupply mission or something, I always rather do that rather than take the dirt road. Notice the duster in the corner here of the perimeter, and you can see the underground bunker that the crew lived in right next to it. This particular battery had two 155s, so the gun positions are over here, and then there was another duster on the far side of the fire base. They also had built a above-ground mess hall, but all of the troops are underground in these underground bunkers. This was one of our larger fire bases. This is where the battery headquarters was located. This was called Artillery Hill. This was a huge base. It was located just outside of Pleiku. It consisted of several artillery batteries, supply facilities, about, I'm guessing, 2,000 troops. It had a searchlight on top of the hill and two dusters. The perimeter was lit, which was the only fire base, the only place I was at in the Central Highlands that actually had a lit perimeter was Artillery Hill. Notice how the engineers had cleared the perimeter significantly and defoliated the area dramatically. When I was duty officer at this particular location, I'd have to go around at night and check these 35 towers that were three-man towers to make sure people were awake. This was a picture taken. I was coming back from a fire base on a Huey, and I took this picture as it was just getting ready to land. This is another black and white picture that I took that shows the searchlight on top of the hill, the reason for the name Artillery Hill. The searchlight was also an air defense artillery unit, although we didn't have anything to do with them. But the searchlight was an amazing tool because it could literally light up the whole area. And it was capable of bouncing off the overcast and lighting up an area miles away. And when the searchlight was on, it was like daytime. So very, very impressive protection for a major base like this. Another fire base, this one happens to be Ben Het. Ben Het was a pretty famous base. It was the northernmost part of the Central Highlands that we were involved in. It was a special forces camp and an artillery base. It was strategically located right where the Ho Chi Minh Trail crossed the tri-border area. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos came together just outside of the perimeter where this fire base was located. It was under siege for many months, for 5 months, I think, in 1969. The siege was lifted just before I got there. In fact, the NVA were so adamant about overcoming this base, because I guess it interfered with the Ho Chi Minh Trail traffic, that they used tanks and tear gas artillery shells in their effort to overrun the base. And the base was pretty heavily destroyed and had to be rebuilt by the engineers. The road in was dangerous. The airstrip in front of it was constantly under attack, so supplies were dropped by air during the siege. The fire base was basically manned by artillerymen from two 175 batteries that were located here. I can remember when I got there, I asked one of my crew chiefs, how come the 175s are all pointing the wrong direction? They're all pointing west. He says, because we don't fire the other way. We only fire into Cambodia and Laos. So in addition to the artillery people on this base, there were CIDG, which is the Civilian Irregular Defense Group, which were indigenous montagnards with Special Forces advisors, and they lived on the fire base on the perimeter with their families and children. And I'm taking the picture here is when I was landing with a Huey, and this is the front gate of the fire base, right next to the airstrip. And it was basically two mountain tops with a saddle between them. This is the upper part of the fire base where we had a duster mounted right on the top. I stayed up there a number of times. And this is the road going down from the upper base down to the lower base. And you can see that they had separate perimeters, and they were a little bit isolated from each other, but not very much. And this shows a picture of the airstrip in front of it, and the tremendous amount of work that the engineers did pushing the jungle back and defoliating the whole place. This was after the siege. Before the siege, I guess the jungle came right up to the perimeter line. This is another picture that I took coming into the fire base on a Huey. I can remember looking down and seeing these giant craters. And each of these craters had water in them, and they looked like swimming pools. And it turns out that when Ben Hett was under siege, it was supported by hundreds of close B-52 strikes. At one point, 1/4 of all B-52 missions to Southeast Asia were to support Ben Hett during the siege. Approaching the fire base in a Huey, I noticed these craters, and they were pretty close to the perimeter line, and the size of these things just were incredible to me, and I just can't imagine being anywhere near an arc-like strike from a B-52. Sometimes all we did was escort an artillery battery to another location. This is a picture that I took. I was on the lead track, and behind me is the convoy moving a 175 battery, and it was taken during the Cambodia incursion in May of 1970. We were following the 4th Division into Cambodia to support the infantry, and I'm in the lead duster for moving this 175 battery. This was the convoy itself as it was setting up outside of Pleiku, and this is another picture of it stopping. I guess we weren't very far outside of Pleiku, and we were stopping because one of the tracks were already causing us problems. And there must have been 20 or 30 vehicles in this particular convoy moving these two guns into Cambodia. We traveled for about 6 or 7 hours, and then finally the 175s pulled off the road, and we set up a fire base in high grass. This is a picture of the two guns being positioned. We hadn't pushed enough dirt around yet, but that basically they were setting up a perimeter and settling in. And then this next picture, if you look carefully, it was dark, it was late in the afternoon, but I took a picture of one of the dusters and the position that they had given us on the perimeter of this brand new fire base. You can see it was just heavy grass around us, and it just didn't look too secure to me at all, but it took a couple of days to really give us to do the preparations that we needed to bring the fire base up to some standard. Just before dusk on the first day, we had a infantry company of mountain yards show up to provide us with security. And the mountain yards had two special forces advisors with them, and they basically set up around the perimeter to give us a little infantry support. And by this time, this was taken probably on the second day or the third day, and we were unloading building supplies, and I think there was a bulldozer involved, and they were pushing dirt around, trying to secure this place. On the third night that I was there, just after dusk, we'd finished our sea ration dinner, and I was asked by a lookout that was sitting in a duster. It was just about dark, and the lookout said, "LT, there's lights across the valley, on the other side of the valley, which is about a half mile away." I had no idea who was in the area, so I went over and I woke up a Special Forces advisor that was sleeping in a hammock. And I said, I got lights in front of me. What do you want us to do? And he jumped off, locked and loaded, and said, screaming at me, fire on him. So I sent a runner over to the other duster, and we prepared a fire mission and started firing on the lights on the other side of the valley. It was now pitch black. And we probably fired a small amount of rounds, maybe 40 or 50 rounds a piece per track. And the lights went out. And I was standing on the back deck of the duster, and I remember just about the time the duster stopped firing, the Mountain Yard infantry started sending up those hand illumination flares. And I looked over to my right, and in the tree line right in front of us, no more than maybe a couple of 100 feet out in front of me, I could see NBA in uniform. Now keep in mind, I'm standing on the back deck of a track, so I'm 10 feet above the infantry. And about the time I saw the NBA in uniform in the tree line, the Mountain Yards opened up with small arms fire, and we ended up with a firefight that lasted maybe 10 minutes, and then nothing the rest of the night. And we found out the next day, after the Mountain Yards sent out a patrol to investigate where our rounds had landed on the other side of the valley, that we must have hit a enemy headquarter unit of some kind that was trying to get out of the way of the 4th Division, and it stumbled on us. And I don't remember them saying that they found any bodies, but they did have a lot of abandoned equipment and blood trails, I was told at the time. And fortunately, that unit, which must have been pretty good size, decided to go around us, and since we obviously wouldn't be pursuing them, and with the dusters, we had a surprising amount of firepower. This is a picture of the next morning of one of the dusters after the firefight. You can see the spent brass. If you look closely, you can see the spent brass under the track, where every time the rounds fired, the spent brass goes under the track. The crew's cleaning up the weapon and cleaning up the site. Let's talk for a second about quads. The quad was called an M35A1 gun truck. Once again, I never heard that designation until I did my research. We just called them quad 50's. This is another World War II weapon, that anti-aircraft weapon that was mounted on the back of a 5-ton truck. We used them in our area exclusively for convoy protection. It had a crew of 4. It had a gunner that sat between the guns. The guns were electrically controlled. And 2 loaders, because they consumed ammo so fast, the loaders were busy just keeping the ammo coming. And a driver. The rate of fire, I'm told, was 700 to 800 rounds per minute per barrel. The range was 1,500 to 2,000 meters. I don't think we ever shot them anywhere near that. They had a unique 50 caliber. It was called an HP for heavy barrel because of the amount of rounds that was going through it and the speed of the rounds. This is a picture of our 2 of our 4 quads. As someone just said earlier, all these quads had names that were painted on them. This I can't remember what the other 3 were, but this one was called Bounty Hunter. And you got to remember that convoys were a huge deal in the Central Highlands, and the reason they were a huge deal is because all the supplies had to come in from Quin Yon across Highway 19, which was a very famous highway in Vietnam. Quin Yon to Pleiku was about 100 miles, and it took about 4 hours, but the convoys ran non-stop from Quin Yon to Pleiku, which was a big supply area, and then from Pleiku it resupplied the rest of the Central Highlands. There were a number of bases along Highway 19. On K, the 4th Division had a base along there at one time. There was a ROC base, a Republic of Korea base. In fact, a couple of times I waited to see if I could catch a ROC convoy, because I I was told the rock convoys never got hit by the VC. The VC were just in terror of the Koreans. And so traveling with a rock convoy seemed to be the safest way to get from Quinyon to Pleiku or Pleiku to Quinyon. You had to have a lot of respect for the drivers of these transportation companies. These young drivers who were driving tanker trucks with avgas, supplies with ammunition. I love this picture because it shows two 175 replacement barrels, which was probably the product that went back, that was sent to Pleiku on a regular basis. Mines were a problem. Ambushes were common on Highway 19. The engineers kept it well paved, and the convoys moved fast. You did not want to get in the way of any of these people. There was also a famous pass just outside of Pleiku called the Mangyang Pass. And at the top of the Mangyang Pass, there was a cemetery. It was obviously French, and there were a lot of white crosses at the top of the pass. And I didn't know anything about it, and nobody knew anything about it. But when I did my research 4 years ago, I discovered that it was pretty famous because the French 100th Mobile Division, which was a very famous division that fought with the Americans in Korea, was ambushed in 1953, and they were forced to retreat to Pleiku over a number of days, and they lost 1,600 men. 1,600 men. So there was a huge number of crosses at the top of that pass in this cemetery. I wonder if it's still there. But it was because of this very famous ambush during the French-Indonesian Wars, Indochina Wars. And the transportation companies got hit so often that they developed their own gun trucks for protection. We used to see these all the time on the highway. These were basically 5-ton trucks with plate steel armor and automatic weapons. And I was told that they had the same strategy that we had with the Dusters and the Quad 50's, and that is that in an ambush, we'd pull off the road and stay in the kill zone and lay down suppression fire until the vehicles could move through. I mentioned to you that we had maintenance issues. These are 17-year-old tracks, and we had a lot of maintenance problems, and the problem was getting spare parts. Sometimes when we couldn't fix a track, we brought it back to Pleiku and would cannibalize it or try to fix it there. We had this thing called a dragon wagon, which we could transport the tracks back to Pleiku. I had a very good motor sergeant who was on his third tour. He was younger than I was, and I was 24. So he must have been 23 and was the best combat soldier we had in the whole battery. He was an E6. He ran our motor pool. He was very resourceful. He came to me one day and he said, "I've got a problem. I've got 6 or 7 transmissions on order, and I don't have any. And I got a track down, and I got to get the track up and running by tomorrow morning. I want to go down and buy a transmission." I said, "Well, be my guest. Where are you going to buy it?" He says, "Well, I'm going to go buy it from the Arvins." Well, I told you earlier that the Arvins were using the Bulldog Walker track as their primary armored vehicle. And so he basically went down, came back with a transmission. And I thought he would come back with a transmission in a box that was basically replacement. He came back with a transmission that was literally lifted out of a working track that the Arvins sold him for booze and supplies. And, people joke about the supply problems in a combat zone. You have to be resourceful. And we had some very efficient scroungers in our battery that were always capable of getting equipment when they needed it. So I ended up traveling the roads a lot, unescorted in a Jeep. This was a picture I took of a couple of guys that were passing me on the road, but this is the only picture I have that's kind of similar to the way I was traveling. The only difference is my Jeep didn't have a 50 caliber in it. But we rode most of the highways the year I was there unescorted. unless we were attached to a specific convoy. The road, for instance, from Pleiku to Khartoum, which was 30 miles, which used to be a terribly dangerous road, we would travel unescorted all the time. This was a period of time when it was a little quieter in the Central Highlands than it had been in the past. We did, I don't think I mentioned it, but just outside of Ben Het, we were protecting a supply convoy for the artillery batteries, and we lost a track to a mine. And that Ben Het road was a terrible road, and it was ambush. There were a lot of ambushes and a lot of mines on that particular highway. So basically, I ended up as a platoon leader in the field for the first few months with 6 dusters on 3 fire bases, and then after that they brought me inside as an executive officer for the battery, and that was basically my tour of Vietnam in 1970. How much time do I have, Scott? Scott, can you hear me?
Keep going. Now, Scotty,
I got something else I wanted to ask you guys about. A lot of you served in Vietnam, and like me, I'm sure there are some of the myths about Vietnam that bother you. And there's a couple of myths that really bug me. And the one that, if I have time to tell you a little bit about, one of the myths is that the U.S. military was defeated by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. And we hear this all the time, that the Vietnam War was the war that we lost and that the military was defeated. That drives me nuts. The research I've done just tells me that's absolutely wrong. Vietnam admitted in 1995 at a press conference that they lost 1.1 million men, both VC and NBA, in uniform during the years the U.S. was in Vietnam. Their losses were 4 times our losses, including the South Vietnamese ARVN losses. And then, of course, there's the 1968 Tet Offensive, which is portrayed by the media as a great communist victory, but in reality was a disastrous blunder. But even the North Vietnamese Defense Minister, General Giap, admitted that the communist losses were devastating. It cost the communists virtually the entire VC infrastructure in the South and most of their guerrilla force. It's been estimated that 14 communist soldiers died for each American and ARVN soldier killed during the offensive. So, a lot of times we're told based on the history books what happened in Vietnam, and they just don't have the facts. In fact, the VC were forced to regroup in Cambodia as a result of the Phoenix program, which was a CIA program, and then also when President Nixon during the Cambodia incursion went into Cambodia in the 70s, he disrupted the VC infrastructure dramatically. It's too bad though, because the communists were watching the unfolding political rest in the United States, and it didn't take a rocket scientist to detect the anti-war sentiment that was going on in the United States. The media gave up on Vietnam in 1968, particularly after Walter Cronkite announced on the evening news that Vietnam was lost. The anti-war movement was gaining momentum. Johnson withdrew from the presidential campaign in the fall of '68. McCarthy ended up losing the election to Nixon. The war continued with Nixon negotiating with the North and preparing to leave Vietnam. Nixon was reelected in '72. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in '73, the same year that all American infantry left Vietnam. By 1972, the war was essentially won in South Vietnam. Hanoi's will was broken. As flawed as the Accords were, it did end the war. And the war was won at that point. The peace accords were signed. We only had to support South Vietnam with supplies, and we promised to come to their aid if they were attacked by the North. Unfortunately, Washington politics took control of the war with a strong anti-war movement. Watergate blows up in '73. Nixon resigns in '74. The Democrats had majorities in both houses, 70, 72, and the midterm elections in 74. The Democrats controlled 67% of both houses. Congress eliminates the draft in 73 and starts 10 years of defunding everything military. In May of 73, misinformed and angry members of Congress snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, which is the way some of the books talk about it, by making it unlawful for the president to expend any treasury funds or combat operations in or over or off the shores of North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Laos, or Cambodia. The Democrats were fully invested in the anti-war movement. Congress refused to support the Paris Peace Accords and cut off resupply to the Arvins. The NBA tested the U.S. by taking way back. And then they proceeded to play coup in the Central Highlands and took play coup, and we did nothing. They then proceeded to Saigon, which fell in 1975. You know, it's apparent to me that Vietnam was lost by Congress. The military was certainly not defeated. And the media, unfortunately, gave up on Vietnam in 1968, and they gave up on the troops in 1968. It's a disservice to the men that served in Vietnam, and certainly to the men who died, that we were defeated by the North Vietnam Army and the VC. It's just not accurate. Unfortunately, that's the way it's characterized in all of the school history books and also by most of the teachers. How do you guys feel about that?
It's exactly what I've been saying for 50 plus years. Walter Cronkite was reporting that war as if you were on the side of communism taking over the South. And that's just exactly what he was doing. What we're experiencing now with the media and how we look at it differently as a country, as opposed to back then, is exactly the way it started. That's when it all started, right back then, when they were supporting the bad guys. And it continued and it grew, and they got more powerful. And so we're at the head of it.
The situation today, there's some interesting information that I just got from the VA. There were 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam on the ground or offshore. And today, and this was supposedly in 2016, there are 850,000 left alive. So out of 2.7 million, there's only 850,000 of us that have served in Vietnam that are still alive. We're dying off at a much faster rate than the non-veterans. The Vietnam vets are disappearing fast, and therefore I think it's important that we tell people. We can't really talk much about it in front of high school kids because of the political nature of the discussion. But we can certainly tell the rest of the population what really happened in Vietnam. Anybody agree with that?
I talk about it all the time in school. It's important that they get the right history. They're given a certain history. We correct them from our own experience. We have the right to do that, and we have the responsibility to do that. I do it all the time.
Yeah, have you been corrected?
I don't know about with them. The students I talk to get it straight.
Yeah, the situation wasn't how Ken Burns had a golden opportunity to correct these myths and failed to do so. He basically just repeated the same old hackneyed myths that that the fake news media has put out for years.
That was disappointing. I agree.
Yeah, it's given us a platform. It's given us a platform to correct him and tell our story. People really want to hear about it now from us.
Yeah, they're listening to Ken Burns. They're not listening to Ronnie Geyer. You mean
they're we talk. We when we have the opportunity to talk, we do, and they listen.
Yeah, we talk to 100 people, and Ken Burns reaches hundreds of thousands or millions. That's the problem. He's got the platform, and he fumbled it.
Yes.
And so exactly, so many people believe Ken Burns was next to God with his
Civil War.
Yeah, with his I agree with you, Chase, and actually Ronnie as well. I'm going to say my piece whenever I have an opportunity to say it, and that we certainly we're not angels, and we did a lot of goofy things as soldiers, and not all of them, but still, we were thrown into a mess that still, why did we not fight from one spot go north? Why were we, you're building your little fire bases, you're building these things. Why did we not just go from one angle to the other and leave behind support troops to fight if the VC appeared? We should have probably taken Hanoi, and it would have probably stopped in 5 years instead of 10 years.
Let me just jump in for 1 second here. Yesterday I had a meeting for the Voices of Veterans, and Ronnie was there for a while. And we talked about this subject, and I brought up a few names like Jane Fonda, McNamara, LBJ, and Dean Rusk, all the bad guys. Essentially, politically, they stopped the bombing of Hanoi, which was ready to surrender.
Yeah.
And then never mind, because I'm not fluent enough in the details, but I didn't know at the time. I was there from 69 to 69 in the whole year, and to me it was activities in front of my eyes. That was it. I wasn't politically swayed because I didn't have any contact with the politics.
But there's another myth that comes up periodically that drives me nuts also, and that's the myth that the U.S. infantry and the Marines are mostly 19-year-old draftees, poorly educated, and so undisciplined that they committed daily atrocities, including the killing of women and children. I mean,
I've heard that also, and I blamed McNamara on a very serious faux pas by saying, because I had a training battery or a training company when I was a basic training company commander of McNamara's 100,000. These are young kids that had an IQ of as low as 67, and he referred to them in the press as cannon fodder. And as a young second lieutenant, I'm listening to Secretary of Defense bullshit us, and he just said the wrong things. It's just wrong to do that, because we tried like hell as a battalion to get these youngsters ready for Vietnam, and it's a story in itself.
The thing that always bothers me is that first of all, our troops were disciplined, and if you violated the engagement rules, you end up getting court-martialed. But what they don't ever talk about is the communist atrocities. And the communists were, they were so bad and so brutal, and atrocities were so common that they hardly received any media attention at all. The North Vietnamese and the VC made attacks on civilians a centerpiece of their strategy. And I got these numbers that just staggered me. Communists assassinated in South Vietnam 36,000 plus Vietnamese and abducted another 58,000. Death squads were focused on village leaders, medical personnel, teachers, and the families of ARVNs and CIDG Mountain Yard soldiers. I heard when I was in Vietnam in the Central Highlands, I heard about VCs going into mountain yard villages, and if they couldn't find the fathers of families, they would butcher the young kids so that they wouldn't become allies of the Americans, because we hired a lot of the mountain yards. The mountain yards were working for the Americans, and the VC knew that. And the atrocities that they committed were incredible, and yet there was never any discussion of that. There's never any visibility of that.
Well, that was just like the picture of the police chief of Saigon shooting the VC, who had just committed murder on a bunch of civilians in
on one of his relatives.
Yeah, and yet the picture without context was allowed in the media. You know, just like the girl that was hurt in the bombing,
Yeah, that's right.
with the naked girl and
The napalm girl.
napalm girl. Again, there's no
Picture.
context, and that's the problem with the media. They were allowed to sensationalize something out of context constantly, and I blame that on the hierarchy of the military for not. The generals for not stomping on that and saying, wait a minute, guys, we want free press, but we don't want you to run amok.
Right.
Well, but it's only recently that someone's doing that. We had to wait till now for that to happen. The last couple of years.
But he got voted out of office, so.
Well, it's not over, but that's another story.
Scott didn't want me to get political about this, but he told me to ask for questions, so I'm asking for questions.
You know, this has been threatening. If I can add, and I bet none of you realize it, it's known in the law, and that is New York Times versus Sullivan.
I gotta mute one of these.
But New York Times versus Sullivan, what this says is, if you are a public figure,
Whoever's talking, you have your, I think your phone and your
there. If you're a public figure, you cannot sue for libel. That's what it is. If John Williams there, if he is a public figure, mayor of some town, I, as a newspaper reporter, can report about how John Williams was raping tiny children in Contra Costa County, and John Williams cannot sue me for libel if you're a public figure. New York Times versus Sullivan. They tried the same crap with private figures. That was Time Magazine, Hill versus Time Magazine. They didn't get away with it there. And that's why, if you saw the Stoneman case, the kid could sue because he was a private figure. Someone like Trump cannot sue for any lie they tell about him. Why did that come about? It was actually, one, an activist court, and second of all, it was an attempt to protect the civil rights movement, which really didn't need the protection. So, New York Times versus Sullivan, go look it up. You'll find out, I'm also an attorney, go look it up, and you'll find out that public figures practically cannot sue. They can be lied about, they can be on and on and on, and that's it. And all this business about the press, fake news, it is indeed fake news. I was involved a lot in politics. I knew Jerry Brown, and so on and so forth. And we would plant in the papers, they would plant in the papers. It's a regular situation. And the press really it just runs amok. New York Times was owned by Jews, and the New York Times never published, even though they had evidence of the Holocaust going on, they never published it, period. And so the American press, I don't see them being too much better in some respects than the communists, because the communists control the press. Here, the press can be controlled by some, and otherwise they're on their own and run amok. If you've been to China, what you find is that it is a capitalist society. It is not communist, but the Chinese are a one-party dictatorship, and we're heading that same direction in this country.
William,
Last
first,
election, the problem is the unsolicited ballots.
Anybody have any questions
The
about
press
the
can
presentation?
take off with it.
Yeah, that's good. But what I'd like to suggest is we have some very good.
You can hear me? Nah.
Yeah, yes, but we're stepping far away now. But I would like to. I'll reach out to some of you guys to put see if we can put together a consistent policy for the organization when we go into schools, so that we speak with good knowledge of what we know about Vietnam. So, any questions on the presentation?
I just want to say that I like what Chase had to say about just presenting your side of the story and the facts. That's what I try to do with the Liberty, not get into politics, and I only want to show the real facts of what took place, and so and I think we need to stay with that. So.
Chase, I had one thing when you mentioned earlier about spotlights, the air defense spotlight batteries.
Searchlight, right?
Searchlights, yeah. I think all of you might be familiar with the Fort MacArthur, which is down in San Pedro. They've got a refurbishment area there for searchlights.
Oh, really?
And it's they've got a pretty decent museum. You might check on a website to see if they're even open, but I've seen them working on those searchlights. Those things are monsters.
When you go there,
Ben, I'm sorry, I kind of hit the wrong button on it, but I sent this. I hope you got it about New York Times versus Sullivan.
Yeah, we did.
Good.
Okay.
And that's what happens in the press, and this is carried on from that war onward.
Chase, great presentation.
Thank you.
Every time I see a World War II movie now, I'll think about those things mounted on a tank body.
Evidently, the Mobile 1, the French unit that was decimated, I was stationed about 4 miles east of it, Edon-K, and we went through there, coming back from the Battle of Ia Drang by truck. So we had to stop off right in that valley on Highway 19 and disperse a couple of times just to make sure we weren't being eyeballed. Going past that hill where where the soldiers are buried, the North Vietnamese, or actually the Communist Viet Minh, buried them vertically, with their faces showing towards Paris, towards France. And they did that deliberately with a message. Now they're probably still there. I don't think they're ever going to let them go. But everybody is standing with their facing France.
That's right. I heard that.
Hey.
All right, let me go ahead. I've got it.
Yeah, Chase, this is Jim Grimm. I think I told you a long time ago, I flew helicopters for the 129th, and we used to escort the convoys up Highway 19 from Quy Nhon to basically to An Khê, and then I guess you guys were safe over to Pleiku. But when I flew gunships, a couple of times we'd escort you guys, and where it got into the Serpentine up around where the graveyard is, very dangerous area because you guys were going very slow, and you'd have to pull off the side of the road like and check things out. But you needed gunship cover, which was our job, and we did that. And of course, you mentioned the Koreans having artillery batteries along Highway 19. That was one of the biggest scares that we had in terms of aviation. We'd be flying up Highway 19, and those Koreans would pop off a round or two and scare the willy out of us. I mean, for no reason. But anyhow, very good presentation. Thanks, because it pointed out a lot of good stuff. Really appreciate that. One comment about the war. I had a very good friend who stayed in the military, my roommate, and he retired as a lieutenant colonel in the Army. And I think it was in probably the late 70s, maybe going in the early 80s, there was the Army War College wrote a white paper about the war, cited many of the statistics that you just gave us, and to a point, the Army the military did not lose that war. It was all thank you to the McNamara and other people like him. But hey, great job. Thanks for doing that.
Yes, there's an outstanding. Let me. We're running out of time, but okay, Len, you've got a question or?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, the great presentation. I got in late, but by the way, I'm an associate member, Lynn Redmond, but I'm not a veteran, and I just appreciate all you guys bringing back these stories and the whole politics. We could go through that for on and on, but my questions had a couple. Quezon, we heard a lot about Quezon over there, and it was being attacked all the time, and how the B-52s had come in. And I'm an Air Force guy. I was like a month away from getting. Anyway, it's a long story, but I was also about 3 days away from going into the Army after I washed out of Air Force officers training. But the B-52s, we felt in the Air Force were not used properly at all. They could have obliterated everything north of the North Vietnam, but and also had a buddy, Jimmy Stewart. He was a tank commander. I don't know the tank designation, but he had a 90 millimeter cannon on it. He was hit by a rocket, and I think he was the only survivor. He was up in the top turret at the time and was blown out. But what about Quezon? And then were you ever hit by any rocket attacks? So that's all my questions.
Fire bases got mortared and rocketed all the time. So it's fairly common to receive mortar rounds and rockets. I can't remember what the rocket was called, but 122s or some number. But we got we were exposed to that on a regular basis. Quezon was in I Corps. I was in 2 Corps. So Quezon was north of where I was. But they did these B-52 strikes from, 35,000 feet or whatever they were flying. They were dropping bombs pretty close to the perimeter of that fire base. Those craters that I showed you a picture of were just outside the perimeter of the fire base. I couldn't believe that they were able to drop them that close to the fire base.
Yeah, and they didn't have guided bombs in either. Those are just massive 1,000-pound bombs dropped.
Yeah. We call that danger close.
Chase, which one of your NCOs suggested that you stand on the back of the quad 50s or the Dusters? They say Lieutenant.
I'm Dan Tall.
Yeah, would you hold this flashlight for us, please? That happened a couple of times.
Let me.
My NCOs kept me alive. They were the reason I survived.
I wanted to mention. So we have our World War II veterans with us today: David Hayward, George Emerson, and the senior Chef Bentley. So. Want to thank you all for being on the call. And I have our next month's speaker who knows a lot about what you were just talking about, John Meyer. John, do you want to tell us what you're going to talk about on December the 9th?
I just got to try to keep up with what Chase did. That was a pretty thorough presentation, but we'll be talking a little bit about the Secret War, and like Chase, thank you for the opportunity to come back and speak again, because I love your charity. But tonight I'm sitting in Tennessee. We've vacated corrupt California.
Yeah.
My heart is in the organization.
Corrupt dead.
Good to hear from you, John. Give me a call. Give me a call. Chance.
Will do, sir.
We can catch up.
Let me quickly do my shtick here, and if I can, I've lost it all. Oh well. Okay, let's quickly. I just want to quickly go through what we're going to that. I'm not going to do any. Only thing on